Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Bricem Indonesia webinar series In Love with English Football, Unique and Exclusive Insights. I am Asti, Events Coordinator at Bricem Indonesia. And today we are very delighted to welcome our three panelists, Mark Palios, Chairman of Tranmere Rovers and former CEO of the Football Association, Emmanuel Elwanandi, Director of Samtini Group and investor at Tranmere Rovers, and last but not least, Anindya Bakri, CEO and President Director of PT Bakri and Brothers TBK, and investor at Oxford United. Today's session will be moderated by Chris Wren, the Executive Director of Bricem Indonesia. And before we start, allow me to review the functionality of this webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share a link with you when it's available after the event is complete. All participants will be muted to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to this webinar, and also to enable our panelists to present without interruption. And if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at any time. It is located at the bottom center of your screen. And we will have time for Q&A session at the end to answer your questions. Okay, now I'm going to hand the screen over to Chris Wren, our Executive Director, who is going to start today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Asti, and to my team for great assistance in putting this on. I'd like to particularly welcome all our Bricem members and guests from the entire extended community of the British Chamber of Commerce here in Indonesia. A particular welcome to Mark Palios, who's over in the Wirral in the UK, to Emmanuel Wanandi, better known as Wandi, and also to Anindya Bakri, better known as Anin. Thanks very much for joining me. As Asti had mentioned to you, there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to put in some questions and answers during the course of this webinar, so please feel free to do so. Where possible, we might invite one or two of the questioners to actually put their own questions directly rather than through me. That'll be at the discretion of Asti and technology. And also we have received some questions in advance, so they'll be bundled up as well and addressed by me. This webinar is called In Love with English Football, Unique and Exclusive Insights. I think for everybody in Indonesia, there is huge familiarity with the Premier League. Tens and tens of millions tune in to watch Premier League games as they're beamed out live, either on free-to-air or on various types of pay-per-view channels in Indonesia. But perhaps there isn't too much understood about what it takes to get into the Premier League. And what it takes is a very, very strong business environment and business infrastructure, and more often than not, international interest and international investment. And we'll be taking a look at that. To begin with, though, I'd like to first of all address this particular webinar and my early questions to Mark Palios. And I do this because in the current phase of English football, having been shut down because of the global pandemic, it can be regarded as any business in some sort of crisis. As mentioned by Asti, Mark has had a very, very prominent role with the Football Association in the past. And I think I'd like to begin with Mark by asking, if you could, Mark, please, just do a little bit of scene setting on what goes on at the Football Association, what your role was, and perhaps just without going into too much detail and stripping things too close to the bones, what the particular challenges were that I presume led to you moving on and moving out. Mark, you're on mute, Mark. Yeah.
Sorry. It's down to me. How's that? Okay. The first thing is that I suppose I went into the FA at a difficult time for the FA. They were insolvent. They had to build Wembley and so forth, and so it was a pretty unique time. My background was that, yes, I've been a professional footballer for 15, 17 years, but also I was a turnaround specialist at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So I was asked to go in to help fix the FA, which was bankrupt at the time. So um, really the issues then, if I gave you my agenda, you'd probably go, well, yeah, you know, we saw that Sven was being courted by Abramovich. We saw that you had the first England players strike and Rio Ferdinand was banned from actually playing for England at the time for 8 months, etc., and so forth and so on. And that'd be the agenda that you would see. But the reality was I needed to find 27 million in 21 days. Otherwise, the whole Wembley thing would crater. They were about to take on 130 million of debt, etc. So there were a lot of issues underneath that I really went in to fix. And as regards we changed the disciplinary system, which hadn't been changed since the 1970s. And having been a pro myself, I knew that one of the complaints was that there was no professional football that sat inside the FA that was then opining on disciplinary matters, etc., so forth. So there are a lot of issues in there that we were dealing with. We did quite a bit. But the reality is that we didn't fundamentally change anything that was what I would call the general structure around the industry in the UK, the governance, etc. And we never really got to some of the thorny issues when I was there, which I still think haven't been addressed. And that is, you know, the strength of the Premier League, for example, and the fact that they bankroll most of the game with the television monies that they get in influence things. So that was the context of what I went in to do. We built Wembley. We changed the disciplinary system. We had a very successful off the field and in Euro 2004, which we should have. I think we should have won that competition. But there you go. Football's football. And that was really my time at the FA. And since that, I've come out and sort of worked in the city as doing turnarounds until I came back to Tranmere in nearly 6 years ago now. I can't hear you, Chris. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
And over that period of time, Mark, that you haven't been there, what have you observed as the progressions or regressions of the Football Association?
I think that, you know, and this, I'll come on to this in a bit in terms of the way forwards. In fact, I've just written to them today on our own position, because I think it's fair to say that to some extent, I felt the FA has actually ceded territory to the professional game in a way that is not helpful to the game necessarily. I can understand that on the basis that they see that, you know, the Premier League do fund most things. But I think if you look at in terms of the context that we've got now, which is the pandemic, and you stand back, and people will stand back, and certainly I'm one of the advocates of this, and you look at football's collective response to the pandemic, it's not been very good. It's been very fractured. It's been, you know, in our own particular case, you can see the self-interest that's in there. And there has been an inability of all of the relevant sort of football bodies, such as the FL, the Premier League, the PFA, the LMA, to get together and really provide a coherent response. And within that, I think, and this is what I would say to the FA, they need to step up or step aside. So potentially, you know, when you look at how the game has responded to this, one of the biggest changes that you might find coming out is that there is a regulator imposed in some way into the structure that will then start to change the way in which the game is governed.
Okay, Mark. Thanks for that response. And for the purpose of really stimulating some questions for later, I'd just like to fast track, and we will come back and expand. What we've noticed with the development of British football has been a lot of change. The catalyst has been some form of crisis, whether it's been Hillsborough, a Bradford fire in the past. These have been the things that have really focused minds through inquiries and so on. And there have been changes for the better, changes that have actually led to English football being absolutely on top of the world at the moment. Without going into detail, Mark, could you just identify 2 or 3 changes that you might like to see come out of deliberation of this fragmented and fractured response to COVID that you referred to earlier?
Yeah, I mean, let's not beat around the bush. The very fact that the Premier League is as dominant as it is has been a fantastic job in terms of marketing a league. And what happens is you then pass the money down into the pyramid system in the UK, England, basically. And that pyramid, I think, is part of the envy of the world, the strength in depth that goes right the way through. And those clubs, such as ourselves, are rooted in the 19th century. And they started in villages and communities and so forth. So that's a massive part of the fabric. And what's been shaky over the years is as the top end of the pyramid, the top end of the Premier League, even within the Premier League itself, those companies are global companies who have access to global revenues. Fortunately and unfortunately, one of the attractions of the pyramid is the link through promotion and relegation right the way through. So on the supply side, on the wages side, they can spend that spending power that they get from access to global markets that other people don't have in the wages market, which then rattles all the way down to the smallest clubs. So we're all affected by that. What's happened over the years is gaps have been created. The principal gaps from the Championship into the Premiership. So you see the ridiculous statistics that all businessmen will recognise, where wages are 107% of turnover. Forget overheads, forget all the other expenses. That's in the Championship. So what's happening in English football over the years, those gaps have increased. Now with ambition, which is the lifeblood of the game, gaps, poor regulation of the key market, which is the wages market, you get a lethal cocktail. And so I'm hopeful, and it's already starting to happen in the lower leagues, that there will be much more restraints on player wages, because once you actually can restrain that, you will actually get to a position whereby your clubs can be self-sustainable. The clubs at the moment put no strength into their balance sheet, in as much that they live hand to mouth just to compete. And as a consequence, you see that when you're hit with the pandemic. As an accountant, I was asked years ago, what's the level of gearing that you require? And the answer is to have enough fat on your back to ride a run of bad luck. So now we come into the pandemic, and these clubs that were struggling financially anyway are really struggling. And I think that I would hope that the player wages, which is the fundamental element to this, is actually going to be radically changed. The second thing that I'd like to see change is the governance, which I've already touched on. You might actually see some more England players playing in higher up in the leagues, because if the player wages market flattens in this country, then you might see more England players coming through. And there are some changes that I would anticipate. Question on TV monies going forwards. Question on the battle between straight media monies and streaming. Question on the habits of fans in terms of going to away matches or watching streams. We're all doing much more online, such as this. So they're the types of things that will impact. And if the wages market goes again, then player values will probably drop as well. So that whole thing, there's not one panacea, but I think if you can see the wages market being pulled back under control, then that will be a lot more healthy, and certainly in terms of the pyramid itself here in the UK.
Thanks very much, Mark. So for the benefit of our participants on this webinar, if you've got any thoughts or questions around this issue of wages and a wages cap, something that exists in other sports and other parts of the world, then please pop your questions up. Likewise with governance, if you have any particular thoughts or questions or comments to make around the TV money, the media aspect, and the development of different types of technology and media and how they influence habits of fans, then again, please post your questions. So our other two panelists, two Indonesian gentlemen who represent two very well-known and respected business families here in Indonesia. Wandi representing the Samtini Group, which is a group that's into automotive, infrastructure, property, hospitality, and in Bakri, the Bakri Group, very, very prominent in mining, steel, media. I'd like to bring them into this conversation now and perhaps begin with Anin. Anin, you represent Bakri and its interest, which I understand together with partners, is around about 30% of Oxford United Football Club. I think the obvious question is, why did you get interested in English football, and why was that interest in the lower leagues?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this nice forum. I cannot say I'm an expert in English football, but I can say that my family has been quite involved with football around the world, including English football. Not many people know that we actually invested in Leicester City 2010 to 2012. So at least we learned a little bit early on that we should be patient and
Yeah.
same Thai partners. So anyway, Oxford, good branding, 130 years, good community in the area, about 50,000 people study and live there. And then, you know, we thought that it is quite exciting to invest along with another, or actually a couple of Southeast Asian investors, some from Thailand and then some from Vietnam. So it is a group of us who believe in English football. And we think if we start from the lower league, in this case, League One, it is such a sweet spot to start experimenting what can be done, right? Whether on and off the pitch, how to run it well, how to learn from the best. But at the same time, we take it as we go. We have seen a lot of successes in the past, whether that's Sheffield United, Bournemouth, all those clubs. So we're of course inspired, but you know, we take one step at a time, and we're very hopeful. You know, the next 11 days will be very important for us. We have 3 games, and who knows, we can go to the next step.
So we appreciate your love of English football. I think very few people would have known that your lack of patience with Leicester, we didn't know you had an association. Just a little bit more patience might have seen you with a hand on a particular trophy that's a bit of a pinnacle. Aside from passion, Anin, what other drivers are there? I mean, I think where we're looking to drill down to here are the synergies with the other business units. Are the synergies with your international relations partners, maybe? Do you have visions in terms of the domestic game? What else is there apart from the family's passion and you and other partners' passion?
Yeah, I think first of all, when we look at UK, it is the origin of industrialization as a whole when it comes to economy, right? And we have been also an industrialist in the last almost 80 years, and we think there are a lot of synergies that can be done, even at the time when people talk about, you know, Brexit coming up and so on and so forth. We think a lot of synergies in terms of know-how, capital, and that's basically what Indonesia needs. And to understand more about, you know, England, English people, what better way to do it than football? I mean, like the High Royal Highness say, Prince William, that maybe football is one of the best power unifying the world. So that's just one obvious thing that I see. Another thing is that in terms of UK capital market, London Stock Exchange is actually quite international and advanced. Just in the last 3 years, we actually see a lot of Indonesian bonds. We call it Komodo bonds, the Komodo dragon bonds. It's actually traded there. That's just one example how, you know, London Stock Exchange is actually more advanced than some of the international stock exchange. So we think there's a lot of similarities, a lot of synergies, collaboration ideas. And I think, and I do have personal interest also going there. I have 2 of my kids already go to high school there. So all stars are aligned, so to speak, Chris.
Okay, thanks very much. Somebody's commented on my wavy hair looking quite stupid with the backdrop in the background. So I might try and lose that for the benefit of that visitor. There have been some really interesting questions come in already, and I will revert to some of them very, very shortly. But I'd like to bring in Wandy here. Oxford, I think most people outside the UK know Oxford because of the university, if nothing else, if they know nothing about football. There isn't a Tranmere University. Or at least as far as I know.
Tranmere College.
Not yet. Wandy, how did you come to be aware of the opportunity of Tranmere and subsequently become confident to want to be an investor in the club?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Chris. Basically, football is a hobby for me in the beginning. So it was basically, besides I'm having a few customers in the UK, I also go to the UK quite a lot to watch football. So a friend of mine went to me, and then we had a discussion of maybe investing in English football, and then it was a very quick how could I say, it was very quick connection, and also a very quick decision with me and Mark. We started last April, and we became investor in August. So I thought it was, I didn't know Tranmere before because it's in League 2 last year. And then, we got together. I was invited into Tranmere to watch the game, and then met with Mark, and then, it just clicked. And, and it happened to be in Liverpool, so, which is my team. So, it was just very, very, very quick.
Okay, and Wandy, Mark mentioned earlier that there is a business twinning sister relationship between Surabaya and Liverpool. Tranmere is just across the Mersey from Liverpool, and definitely in the business context is very much a part of the city. Was that in any way part of the influence in your decision, the relationship with Surabaya and East Java?
Not really, because I didn't know Liverpool was a sister city of Surabaya until I went there. It was basically a business decision. It was a little bit of hobby also. I wanted to learn, how to run the business. I really didn't have any idea about the footballing business. So that's the reason why we went into Tranmere. I guess we partnered with one of the best owners in English football. So but as far as Surabaya is concerned, it was a G2G. From my understanding, it was a G2G project. It was not a private project. So it's my decision was not because of Surabaya.
All right, thank you, Wandy. I'm going to flip this question over a little bit to Mark. I mean, unless a business or an individual has cause to be engaged with Indonesia, they don't know much about the country. So to what extent was the Surabaya the influencing thing for you from what you'd heard about Liverpool and Indonesia? And as an owner wanting to be quite careful about what investors to accept into your fold and needing to share same values and so on, how did you take care of the development of that relationship and the values of your club?
Well, it's the whole issue in terms of why we went into Indonesia was that in coming to turn around this place, you look at the potential of the club, and one of the potentials of the club was to leverage off my background at the FA in terms of development, and also the club's development of players as well, and the fact that Merseyside is and the northwest of England is what I call a unique piece of footballing geography, whereby it's the birthplace of, as Annie was saying, it's the birthplace of not only the Industrial Revolution but also the professional game, etc. So we've developed an international side to what we do. We were already in China working with the Inner Mongolian government, who are the pilot province for the development of what they call campus football, grassroots basically, in China. And we were asked to contribute to the city's twinning with Surabaya. We went over there, and from our perspective, if I'm looking at where we're trying to go, we're also been in the States for the last year. So we have China, the States, and Surabaya. So three of the top sort of most populous countries in the world. Great markets for us. So that was one aspect to it. But it was serendipitous. We went to Surabaya. We met with Mayor Risma, and she was very instrumental in sending a team of elite kids over from Surabaya with two of their coaches as part of our international program. So we started to train them just as we trained Chinese coaches, and we had American kids over and so forth. And they came over, and it was when they came over actually that he's now a mutual friend of both Wandy's and mine, Simon. He sort of introduced the fact that Wandy was looking to put a toe in the water in terms of English football. So it was as serendipitous as that. We met, and as Wandy says, we clicked. It was one of those things whereby what's important to us, we came back to, this is a club I played for many years, and one of the problems in English football is the lack of quality control over investors into clubs, if I put it that way. And we were approached by quite a number of people who, if anybody watches English football, you probably know these people because they've been around sniffing around clubs, and they are of dubious origin, should we say. So we met with Wandy, and it's one of those things whereby, when you get to know the family, you know that their values, etc., are exactly what we want to do. I know we've had the conversation, and you sort of verified our choice, as it were. But it was one of those things where you just know, and there was a synergy. Nikki said to me I was fairly harsh in our first meeting when we sat down one day and we had a lunch, and she said, I was saying, well, why are you interested? Because it's an obvious question to ask, so let's ask the question. And Wandy was totally honest about what he was wanting to do, and so it was that. It was very much getting the right person. With the connections in Indonesia, then of course one of our focuses is now Indonesia compared to where it was, which was just China and the US to start with. And we hope that we can develop that relationship in terms of both outbound stuff that we do in Indonesia. And we already, Wandy organised, together with Valentino, who's well known as a sports commentator in Indonesia, he organised a tournament just before COVID started. And of course, everything's gone on hold with COVID, but we are very optimistic about the developments of our relationship in Indonesia, as well as, vice versa, in terms of doing what we initially intended, which was to use the northwest of England as a place where you can have football tourism or you can have elite developments, and we can do both of those.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Anin was with me about 18 months or so ago, maybe a little bit less. In the UK, he was representing CADIN, which is the national counterpart in Indonesia of the British Chamber of Commerce. And we certainly all do appreciate the value that having an engagement with English football can have on the reputation of Indonesia, which, as we know, we've just agreed, is a country that is perhaps not so well known and needs some better PR. Would you say, Anin, that your relationship with English football has helped this bilateral knowledge, but more particularly knowledge of Indonesia and what's going on and what the opportunities are there?
Well, Chris, it is certainly a conversation starter for those who know. We don't necessarily advertise it that much, but just in general, I think there are so many things that can be done between the two countries, and I think the two countries can learn from each other, And as Indonesia is going up the value chain in general, I think UK has a lot to offer. And we find that in the last 18 months since our visit, actually a couple of developments, quite frankly, are beyond my expectation. You know, we got halted a little bit with the COVID-19 in the last 3 months. But you know, this is one of the examples that the private sector as well as the government sector from both countries and actually cities as well. I think you mentioned about Surabaya, and I'm not surprised that Jakarta can also be a part of it at one point in time very soon. Because when we went to London, we went to see the city mayor, and he was actually quite familiar. He has visited Indonesia and quite familiar with the city or the country. So Chris, you know, I think I'm very hopeful that a lot of things can be done within the two countries, and like I said, is very much exciting and full of fun also to be able to be part of the history, like what Mark says about football.
Wow, could be a bit of a lottery as to which football club might be associated with a twinning with the City of London, but we'll set that one aside for now. I'm starting to try and tie in some questions to comments that have been made by each of you, and I think a fair question has come up here, which can go to Wandi and Anin. At what stage do you think that wealthy investors might decide to invest into local football, and they designate that as Indonesia or Malaysia, rather than looking to the European or British football?
Well, I think
Wandi.
I think it's possible. Yeah, I mean, we're always, you know, in terms of opportunities. I think we're always looking for different opportunities. I think same thing with Anin as a businessman. I think you know, we probably have the same viewpoint. So we're not really, you know, it's just at the moment we're not really looking into that because we have other businesses that we have to run. The football or the Tranmere issue or the Tranmere stakeholders is basically just a coincidence. It happened very quickly, you know, and it was not. We're a minority there. We don't run the business on a day-to-day basis. We left it to Mark with Mark. So, but you know, to answer your question, I think it's still possible. You know, if the opportunity arises, and you know, if everything clicks, you know, as I said before, I think it's possible to do.
So, Anin, if I could just tag on something to that question, both of you have mentioned that one of the reasons why you chose lower league clubs is it's a logical, better risk managed way of getting experience and knowledge about the business of football. Do you think there will, so adding to that question, do you think there will come a time when you will exercise that knowledge and experience in the domestic game in Indonesia?
Yeah, Chris, actually, as I mentioned, that I'm actually quite new in football, but my family has been there for a while. We have invested in a couple of football teams in local league, the Premier League of the local league, and the latest one being Persija, which is the Jakarta team, which is one of the top 2, top 3 elite teams in the country. I mean, like at least in 3 areas I can think of as we are discussing. In terms of professionalism, I think we have a lot to learn in running a club or in running a league, let alone international standard for national football, right? And the second thing also, I think commercialization of football needs to be enhanced in the country, because at the end of the day, that will help the sustainability of making sure that the players' well-being are taken care, and the satisfaction of the audience is being taken care as well. And lastly, I think this is also the passion of my my partner, including in Oxford United, Eric Thohir, who used to own Inter Milan as well as DC United. He thinks that one day, sports has to be an industry in Indonesia, because you have a good 52 million people watching football every weekend. You have 20 to 25% of the big MU's, Chelsea's, Arsenal's fans around the world actually in Indonesia, and so on and so forth, right? It'll be sad if we cannot just bring up the sophistication and turn that to become a very competitive. At the end of the day, we gotta win some games, right? It'll be a pity if we cannot materialize that. So I think expertise from Mark, and also passion from Wandi and I and many others, the more the merrier.
Yeah. Thank you. You've now raised the issue of commerciality and getting more mature from a commercial point of view. A question coming in from Rob Davis, who is very closely associated with both the organizations airing EPL in Indonesia and the domestic football scene as well. And he asks, I think, a very relevant question, and maybe Mark might be the first to answer this, and in from the perspective of having a media element to your business also. Many see this period of the price EPL rights as now being out of touch with the broadcasters and in turn the watching public. Given that social media platforms bid last time around streaming rights, what does the panel think will be the new business model for the game to be aired? Are they comfortable with the American giants, such as YouTube, Google, Facebook, and so on, getting their hands on this asset of national importance? Mark first.
Right, I may disappoint in the answer. It's not really my area of expertise. I leave all this to the guys who can deal with this. All I would say, that from my view, is that one of the aspects of football in the UK, and I speak about the UK or England, and that is that the solidarity in terms of the money that comes in, it's shared out to a greater extent than it is in other leagues. So in the likes of Spain, I think the extent to which it's shared out is dramatically different, because the clubs almost own the rights themselves, etc. One of the fundamental things that's been successful in English football has been the way and the extent to which television money is shared out for the collective. I think that this is my major concern, and lower down in the leagues such as ourselves, there are two different animals. The ones in the Premier League, and probably even in the Championship now, the bigger clubs, they don't rely so much on the paying gates as we do down in Leagues 1 and 2, and there is a real split between the two. I think one of the concerns lower down is that if we get into the position whereby the media rights currently, the TV rights, are collectively bargained, whereas streaming rights are not, you'll then start to see a further divergence in terms of wealth. And then, the likes of Sunderland, for example, will be a lot richer than us relatively if this starts to happen. And I think the breakdown of the existing media markets, I think what you've got to look at is what I touched on before. Is fact, you have some global players now in the Premier League. The top 6 are global players. And as a consequence, I can actually see all of the moves from FIFA and UEFA, not just into European leagues, but actually into global leagues in some way. So, I think you're going to have a globalization at the very top of the game. And that's one dynamic that will clearly impact. In terms of the media rights going forwards, as I said, we do get a fair share of, well, say a fair share, we do get a share of that here. And the problem is that, you will know, as when I went to the FA, one of the things that struck me right between the eyes is, if I'm a businessman, my object is to kill off the competition. But actually, if I'm a sports administrator, my object is to reinvent that competition week in and week out, year in and year out. And it's getting that balance right that's the difficult thing when you have naked commercialism. And you have to accept that sport, to me, is one of those things. Just like you have consumer protection legislation, you need competition legislation around sport, because otherwise you're going to find that you'll be creamed off right to the top, and you will destroy what I think, certainly in this country, is a real part of its fabric, and that is the extent to which, you know, here every 2 weeks, you know, there's 7,000 people that are actively entertained. You know, there's probably 20,000 people that are really interested in what's going on. And so, you know, I mean, these are small figures in terms of Indonesia, I know, but they're big in terms of England. So, you know, that thing is one of the sad things I think will happen.
Okay.
Really.
Thanks.
And the big guys themselves, you know, we already know that they're very strong, these large companies, and you know, controlling them will be very difficult.
And so, Anin, with your media hat on, how do you see the future of football from the consumer's point of view? Is there going to be an impact on attendances in places like Indonesia? And are you in any way worried about these American-owned giants, as our questioner referred to them, like YouTube, Google, and so on, muscling in on the domestic opportunities?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things, Chris, there is pluses and negatives. And the biggest worry is whether the increase of the rights value of price will benefit in improving the game itself, right? Improving the state of the game professionalism or the club's competitiveness and so on. We own 2 free-to-air stations, which simply means that people are watching it for free using antenna. And in 2014, we bought the rights for World Cup. And we're not pleasantly surprised by any mean, but we paid probably top 10 in the world in terms of the price because of sheer numbers of the audience that we have, right? So those things happen, and even right now, EPL still has about probably 3 million paying customers in Indonesia. But with all these digital giants coming to the game from overseas, whether that's America or from domestic also, will change the dynamic a little bit. It makes a lot of the media players have to think about other ways to monetize the payment that you have to make to purchase the right. But as I mentioned, Chris, you know, all these things is nice and good. People will pay, but unless we have some sort of give back or plow back of all of this money being paid to the game, I think it is a pity that the sports is not going to improve over time. Yeah.
Thank you for those two answers. I suppose in the light of the bid that is on the table from Saudi Arabia for Newcastle United Football Club, I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with that. I'm bundling a number of questions together, and I apologize to those who've put in the questions, but the logical way to do it. And I'm relating this actually to Mark's experience of Wandi and perhaps Anin's experience the other way round. What sort of governance is exercised as standard with a foreign investor wanting to take an interest in a club? Was it in any way off-putting? Is it prohibitive? And the final part of that is, do you think more should be done to deter dominance from certain countries? So, Mark, let's talk about, first of all, about the governance that you put in place in basically checking out the business interests and so on of Wandi.
If you're saying we, us personally, as opposed to what the EFL did. Pardon? As a club?
As a club, yeah.
Purely, it was majorly left down to ourselves. And I know that I think the extent to which the Premier League looks at things, because they have more cash, I think they probably do more than the EFL certainly did a few years ago when I looked at it, in terms of they'll background check, etc., etc. Molly won't be surprised. We did our own stuff, but it was purely down to the fact that we have, associate directors who have connections, who can research, etc. And for us, we checked out. There have been a number of people that have come to us, and it doesn't take much in the days of the internet to go out and find quite a bit on people. So it was really left down to the club to do it, and that's one of the disadvantages of that. As it happens, we were happy to stumble across, the Wanandi family, and we understand, and it has a reputation, and it has a place in Indonesian politics that we all know, and so it was quite easy for us to do that and to check. I think for me the most important thing was the individual motivation of when I spoke to Wandy as to what did it fit, did it make sense, did I understand that, and I think that's right. In terms of the what the EFL do, you literally just send you send the details of the guys to the EFL. I think one of the problems we've had here in the UK is that it all seems retrospective at times, because I've seen somebody sell a club for £1 and pass the parcel. And the reality is, when you ask the EFL what the situation is as regards checking these people out, well, they have to provide sufficiency of funds. I think it's within 2 weeks, having taken over the club. But what happens if they haven't got sufficient funds at that time? They've taken over the club. So, really, the whole thing needs a root and branch change. And there's some of the things that I think that will be looked at in the course of the next year, because of the combination of the problems that they've had with various clubs.
Okay, so well, let's hope any investor would at least be able to come up with the pound as proof. Anin, did you find the process in any way onerous or intrusive or unfair or unwelcoming?
I think it is fair, Chris. First of all, I think there is a natural filter when you want to invest in football overseas in general. Because it is, you have to think of it as an investment that is not like you're investing in a, liquid financial instrument. So you have to believe that you are in for the longer term, right? Now, the second thing with EFL, I find the process has been quite fair. They do background check, especially when you are nominated to become a board member. They ask a couple of questions, but in general, I think they have done some diligence on the potential board members, which I think is good. All right. Now it makes me wonder, and I see some of the questions in the Q&A. What can we do more in Indonesia to make sure this type of thing, in terms of governance, in terms of diligence, can be done? Because a lot of times, the quality of the clubs may actually depend on the priority or determination of the owner in taking this club to the next level.
Thanks very much. I guess we have to address a very big elephant in the room here, and that relates to what happened, I think it was last week. All Scottish leagues and lower leagues English, in fact, every league except the English Premier League, decided to come up with a formula to end the season. Obviously, a couple of questions don't know what the outcome of that was, but the outcome has been for Tranmere Rovers that they are to be relegated. And in the context of Oxford, that was sitting in 4th place at the time, the opportunity to go on and play in the playoffs for promotion. Mark, we haven't got too long, and this is probably unfair to ask you to deal with this in a minute or two. And I know that you're considering a number of options and keeping an eye on how they play out. But as a club, what does it mean in terms of morale for that to happen in the way that it did? And how significant are the financial ramifications of it going into next season?
The essence of this is, there's very little I can say on it in terms of where we are in terms of the process. I think the process itself was flawed, majorly flawed. I think it was lazy. I think it's also inconsistent with what's happened at different levels in terms of the FA's opinion on things. Having said that, Wandy and I have talked about this, and his counsel to me, and it's entirely right, is that we need to be focusing on the positives. And what he has done is bound the fans, which they're pretty close to us anyway as a club, because for me, the fans are the club. It's a concept, the club. And whilst we own the sort of, if you like, the corporate entity that it is, it's basically the fans that are the club. So, it's really focusing them on the positives and not being a victim. And that's certainly what, Wandy and I and Lukey, we speak most days and we message most days. So, I was appreciative of the fact that, from their perspective, having invested in us fairly recently, and then when we suddenly get demoted, I don't use the term relegation. It's not great. In terms of the motivation of the fans, well, it's a question of turning that into a positive. So we had a Q&A last night, and the fans are very positive, and they're I'm trying to get them away from this sort of victim type mentality. And so we will be fine. We will work through it. It doesn't mean to say we accept the injustice, or we won't follow every route that we have to. Put it bluntly. Anybody who knows anything about football knows that, and what we tried to do was to measure the margin of error in PPG, which covers things like the fact that we strengthened in the transfer window, so that our second half season results will be stronger. So we were in a run of form. We won 3 away games on the trot. The last 3 games were all away, and we'd won all of those. And we had 4 of the teams just above us to play. We had a game in hand. We were 3 points behind. So everybody knows that we had an excellent chance of actually avoiding relegation. But we were not given that chance to play out. Having said that, the teams with a lesser chance statistically to get promoted are given a chance to play in the playoffs. And, I'm not having a go at Oxford here at all. I'm looking at the league below us. And the teams in the Championship are given a chance to play out. And even the team at the bottom of the League Two is given a potential reprieve in the event that the National League doesn't play. We're not given that, and it may be that League Two doesn't play next year because we don't have paying gates. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess. It's symptomatic of what I was touching on before, which I think is a lack of governance and a lack of leadership in terms of the football industry.
Anin, I'd simply like to ask you, not really how Oxford feels about it, but do you think the process was fair?
Difficult, Chris, because it's a very emotional process, I would say, more than procedural or logical process, right? I think Wandy and Mark would agree that in the last, I would say, like 3 to 4 weeks, we didn't know what was in the discussions, at least for me, right? And then there are a couple of delays, couple of meetings coming up to that. And then, of course, the result, we're pretty happy that, we can be in the playoff, but I can imagine it could go anywhere, left or right, right? So it is a very difficult moment, I understand, in the COVID-19 environment. So I would say the process has been pretty difficult to digest, Chris.
I think that's a very fair response, Anin. I would just like to be a little bit frivolous here, if I may, Mark. We have a listener who's actually chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia, and for his sins finds himself a shareholder with Partick Thistle, who also share having been demoted without an opportunity to play another game. And he is offering you a pre-season match, Partick Thistle versus Tranmere Rovers, and wait for it, in true Scottish generosity, is offering to pay for the beers after the game. Do you want to take him up on that?
Yeah, I'll say yes, but if you know football, you even though we have a Scottish manager, you really consult with them first as to what the plans are for the pre-season, whenever it is. But no, delighted that we wish Partick Thistle all the best, because we will be following straight behind them, especially if they get a good result together with Hearts. So we appreciate their position, and we appreciate the offer of a pre-season friendly. Certainly, there've been some I wouldn't say unholy relationships built as a consequence of this, but there are a number of clubs that I think we can relate to. And Anin, by the way, I do wish you all the best. I happen to like Oxford United, so Nikki, my wife, went there. She's the vice chair. She went to Oxford, so she's got a.
You need any you can give. Thank you.
So also from the same question from Ainsley, I think he makes a very good point, and he's asking you really, when I make this statement, asking you for a judgment call: is there disparity between government support for top clubs and for lower leagues? Tottenham Hotspur have been given £175 million on a soft loan of 0.5% per annum. Are we likely to see genuine government support to fill the gaps in financing for lower leagues in the same way as it appears it's readily available for top clubs? Mark?
Sorry, is the Tottenham loan really from the government? Is it, or is it? I don't know that.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. It's from the Bank of England. It's from the Bank of England, which is de facto a government-supported safety net.
Yeah, I don't know the details of the loan, so I'm loath to comment on that. Going back to my earlier training, but one of the things that I did with the EFL quite early on was help them to size the cash hole that was coming in terms of the EFL. And I keep saying to them, I didn't do that just with them just for the sake of curiosity. If you're working in turnaround, you say, well, okay, how do we fill the hole? And one of the work streams would be, if it was me, would be looking to government to see what you can do. Now, you have to recognise again that we're just an industry that sits probably at the back of the queue in terms of sympathy from the government in terms of cash. So you have to be realistic about that. Having said that, it's one of the industries that is severely damaged because of the fact that, we require paying gates, especially lower down. So for me, I would have been working that particular seam of potential finance for quite some time. And if it isn't this month, it's next month, it's the month after. In France, they put 200 million euros, I think, into the game. But then again, they recognized that they had actually been much more forceful in stopping, the playing of professional matches over there. So it's not on all fours with where we are. I think the loan system that they put in place over here for clubs, I don't think any clubs lower league clubs have successfully accessed that, simply because it's been put back into the commercial market. And I worked for years with banks, and I know that they just wouldn't back lower league football clubs for all the reasons that we know. So there has been a lack of progress in that area. I still think it's something that they should push on, because at the end of the day, as we see this push further and further out, you're seeing all of these clubs getting more and more stressed financially. And I think what will happen is, over the course of the next 2 weeks, you've got June wages, then you've got July wages, and so forth. And I think the stresses will really come on over the course of the summer. And I would expect and would hope that there'd be some kind of movement to further support clubs. Having said that, they've also relaxed the insolvency process around it. So they may mean that we'll have sort of debtor in possession type insolvencies, which I won't go into too much detail on, but that could be helpful as well.
So it sounds very much as though pressure is going to be on financially, inevitably, for many, many clubs. And that may mean that there are more opportunities for more foreign investors, and maybe more investors out of Indonesia that share the same sorts of reasons and drivers as Anin and Wandi for getting involved. So I would perhaps like to address a closing question to Wandi and Anin, and it's how would you describe your actual experience of being involved in English football vis-a-vis your expectations? And could you recommend taking a stake in English football to other
Should I switch
Indonesian
off
parties?
now?
Yeah, to other Indonesian parties with an affinity for the game. So your actual experience vis-a-vis expectations, and could you recommend it to others being an investor in an English football club? Wandi, would you like to take that first?
Oh, well, I think the whole process itself for us was very, very quick. Um, um, as I said earlier, we're new to the business. We're new um, um, to English football as an investor. But I think I guess it depends on your partner. We're very lucky to have Mark as our partner, and so far the experience, even though we're only a minority, but we chat every day. We discuss things, even through COVID. We we already plan for the future. Even though we're in League Two, we replaced the pitch over the COVID-19 period. So yeah, I mean we're at the end of the day, it's a business decision. At the end of the day, it's like any other business. If your partner is, if you have the right partner, I think everything should be fine.
I think Mark, he kept a script really, really well there. Anin, what about you?
I was impressed with that one.
So I think similar, Chris. One, you gotta like your partners, and we know the Thai partners and the Vietnam partners, along with, of course, my partner from Indonesia, Eric. And that's important because the challenge is not easy. To go from League One to go on top of League One and then try to go to Championship League, that's already a task, right? Let alone if you have a bigger aspiration to go forward to the Holy Grail League. But if you are up to the challenge and you believe that you can bring something back to the community, bring them proud, bring them wins, I think that is also quite valuable, for an investor like us. And whether we would recommend others, well, I'm afraid to say anything because a lot of factors come into play when you recommend this kind of investment. But if you like the challenge, you like the set of investors, and you think bringing value to the game, to the community is of importance to you, sure, I think you should take a look at it.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed. This has been a really pleasant conversation, and I do hope our audience, I'm sure, will have appreciated having you with us. Some of the subject areas difficult to talk about. Others, I think, show a great deal of optimism in the possibilities of the existing relationships and further relationships between Indonesia and the UK. In terms of sport and football in particular. I, as a Chamber of Commerce and representing it, we wish Wandi and Mark in these difficult times, we hope you find your silver linings, and whatever those outcomes are, that next season you can reshape and aggressively again challenge to be in that rightful place. And everybody wishes you the best of luck in the playoffs, which start in a couple of weeks' time, I think, or a few weeks' time. To Wandi, investor in Tranmere Rovers, representing the Santini Group; to Anin, investor in Oxford United, representing Bakri Group; to Mark Palios, chairman of Tranmere Rovers; to everyone who's joined us, particularly so many guests and many people requested recordings as well that couldn't attend today. On behalf of Britcham Indonesia, thanks very, very much for joining us. It's our pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Chris.
All the best, Anin.
Again, Emmanuel. Thank you, Wandi.
See you, Wandi.
Thank you.